January 17, 1940. The eastern plains of Europe lie under a gray, frozen sky. Mud churns beneath hooves. A column of horses strains against wooden-wheeled wagons, dragging artillery through fields scarred by frost and shell craters. The air is thick with the scent of hay, sweat, and cold metal. Soldiers wrapped in threadbare coats shout over the creak of harnesses and the groan of axlewood. Some horses stumble, hooves slipping in the half-frozen mud, their breath steaming like smoke in the bitter air. Thousands of miles away, in the sunlit heartland of America, 6,000 trucks roar along packed dirt roads, engines humming steadily, carrying ammunition, fuel, and rations with mechanical precision. Drivers sip coffee from metal mugs, scanning the horizon. There is confidence in every turn of a wheel, efficiency in every delivery. Two worlds of war, one bound by tradition, endurance, and the lives of 2.8 million horses. The other powered by gasoline, assembly lines, and industrial might. This is the story of logistics deciding victory, of men, machines, and animals racing against time, terrain, and an unforgiving war. The question lingers: could Germany's reliance on hooves survive against the age of wheels and engines? By the winter of 1940, the world was already engulfed in war, and armies were grappling not only with enemy fire, but with the invisible, relentless force of logistics. Germany, in the midst of executing its Blitzkrieg strategy, relied on a complex web of supply lines, lines that stretched across hundreds of miles of harsh terrain. The German army of 1939 to 40 included over 2.8 million horses, more than any other single resource in their military inventory. Each horse was assigned a vital role: hauling artillery, towing wagons of ammunition, carrying food and water, and ferrying equipment through landscapes where engines often failed. Yet for all their strength and endurance, horses were fragile in the context of modern warfare. A horse required daily feed, roughly 10 to 12 pounds of grain and up to 10 gallons of water. Maintaining the health of these animals consumed resources that could have supplied soldiers or weapons instead. Horses fell victim to mud, freezing temperatures, exhaustion, and disease. On the Eastern Front, where roads disappeared beneath winter snow and mud, every mile traveled by hoof was a calculated risk. Commanders wrote in diaries of men collapsing from fatigue and of horses dying along supply routes, leaving entire artillery pieces stranded for days. The reliance on horses was not a philosophical choice, but a necessity of industrial limitation. Germany's economy, heavily strained by rearmament and territorial expansion, could not produce enough motor vehicles to replace the millions of horses in service. By contrast, the United States, untouched by European destruction and with access to vast automotive factories, was able to field approximately 6,000 trucks for its forces in the early war period. Though vastly outnumbered in sheer numbers, these trucks represented an unparalleled increase in logistical efficiency. Each truck could carry multiple tons of supplies over long distances with far fewer human or animal lives expended. Germany's horse-drawn system worked in theory, especially in the early phases of the Blitzkrieg. During the invasion of Poland in September 1939, German divisions moved swiftly, supported by horse-drawn wagons that kept up with motorized infantry and tanks. But as the campaign extended into France and eventually the Soviet Union, the limits of horsepower became glaring. Supply trains slowed as winter ice and spring mud rendered roads impassable. Horse casualties mounted. Even minor skirmishes could disrupt the fragile chain of transport. If a bridge collapsed under a wagon, or a column of horses panicked under artillery fire, the movement of entire divisions could stall for days. Meanwhile, American doctrine emphasized mechanized mobility from start. Trucks, powered by gasoline engines and supported by repair depots, allowed U.S. forces to move supplies quickly, adjust to changing battle lines, and maintain consistent pressure on enemy positions. The psychological impact on soldiers was significant. American infantry knew that a fresh convoy of supplies would arrive with ammunition, food, and medical support, reducing the uncertainty of frontline survival. For the Germans, each mile gained by horse was a gamble against exhaustion, injury, and the unpredictable whims of nature. Even beyond the battlefield, feeding 2.8 million horses placed enormous strain on German agriculture and transport networks. Grain that could have fed soldiers or civilians had to be diverted to stables. Fuel shortages compounded the problem. Trucks were limited, so horses were the default solution. But horses themselves needed food and care, creating a cyclical dependence that modern mechanization had largely eliminated. The contrast with American logistics could not have been more stark. A single truck convoy could transport what dozens of wagons required, with no need to pause for feeding or rest. In human terms, the consequences were immediate and visceral. Soldiers described the despair of trudging behind exhausted animals through mud that sucked at boots and wagons alike. Commanders kept meticulous records of horses lost to injury or fatigue, noting that sometimes the death of a single horse could immobilize entire artillery units. In contrast, American drivers reported smooth marches across rural highways, the steady hum of engines reassuring, even comforting, to troops reliant on supply chains that rarely failed. The contrast was not merely technological. It reflected a fundamental divergence in military philosophy. Germany, despite its early successes, was tied to a system built on endurance, tradition, and brute force. The United States embraced industrial scalability, mechanization, and forward-thinking infrastructure. In the frozen fields and muddy roads of Europe, the stage was set. One army relying on living engines, another on mechanical precision. The stage was now prepared for the choices, challenges, and consequences that would define campaigns in Europe. The next months would test whether horsepower could keep pace with the demands of modern war, and whether American trucks would prove that efficiency, not tradition, would dominate the battlefield. By 1941, the contrast between German reliance on horses and American mechanization had become a defining feature of the war. The German Wehrmacht, despite commanding millions of men and animals, struggled to match the speed and flexibility of modern, motorized forces. Industrial limitations, coupled with strategic overreach, created bottlenecks that would prove decisive on multiple fronts. Germany's industrial base had focused heavily on tanks, aircraft, and weapons production, but motor vehicles remained a secondary priority. The army attempted to compensate with horse-drawn wagons, even for tasks ideally suited to trucks. Each division carried hundreds of horses, accompanied by specialized personnel responsible for feeding, grooming, and medical care. Veterinarians were pressed into service as essential military staff, ensuring that the animals could perform long marches and survive in extreme climates. Yet even with meticulous care, horses could not match mechanical reliability. In the spring thaw of 1941, mud on the roads of Belarus and Ukraine turned movement into a nightmare. Wagons sank axle deep, horses struggled to pull artillery, and supply convoys slowed to a crawl. The Americans, meanwhile, were applying lessons learned from both World War I and pre-war exercises. U.S. Army planners emphasized motorized logistics as the backbone of operational doctrine. A single 2.5-ton truck could replace dozens of horses, carrying fuel, ammunition, and rations with far less manpower. Maintenance depots and fuel distribution networks allowed trucks to travel hundreds of miles with minimal delays. Even when a vehicle broke down, spare parts and repair teams were available, a stark contrast to the irreversible loss of a horse injured or exhausted in the field. This industrial advantage was not merely theoretical. During the North African campaigns, American logistics enabled rapid movement across deserts that would have immobilized horse-drawn units. Supplies could be shifted to exploit breakthroughs or reinforce threatened positions within hours, while German columns of wagons struggled to traverse sand, rock, and scorching heat. In Europe, this mobility translated into operational flexibility, giving mechanized armies the ability to launch offensives without the constant fear of supply collapse. The human cost of Germany's dependence on horses was profound. Soldiers became intimately aware of the vulnerability of their supply lines. Diaries from the Eastern Front describe men walking alongside dying horses, improvising routes around bogged-down wagons, and rationing their own food to feed animals critical to the army's movement. Horses, once symbols of strength, became liabilities under the relentless pace of modern war. Meanwhile, American soldiers experienced a fundamentally different war. Reliable truck convoys meant fewer marches on foot, consistent access to food and ammunition, and a psychological reassurance that supply would reach them, regardless of terrain or enemy action. Leadership decisions were shaped by these logistical realities. German commanders were forced to slow advances to allow horse-drawn units to keep pace. Blitzkrieg's early speed, once the hallmark of German strategy, was increasingly constrained by the limits of living engines. Every pause exposed divisions to counterattack, attrition, and weather. American officers, in contrast, could plan operations around the predictable performance of trucks, enabling simultaneous offensives across multiple fronts with minimal disruption. Even technology alone could not bridge the gap for Germany. They experimented with half-tracks, tractors, and light vehicles, but production was limited, and the scale of mechanization required to replace millions of horses was impossible under wartime constraints. Meanwhile, the United States automotive industry, untouched by invasion or bombing, continued producing trucks at a staggering rate. By the time American forces entered Europe in 1942-43, every U.S. division was accompanied by a motorized backbone that could operate independently of rail lines, roads, or animal endurance. By mid-war, the implications were clear. Logistics were not merely support for combat. They were a decisive weapon. The speed at which armies could move, supply, and sustain themselves dictated the pace of campaigns. Germany's reliance on horses, while a historical necessity, had become a strategic vulnerability. America's reliance on trucks, though small in absolute numbers, provided leverage that multiplied the effectiveness of every soldier and every gun on the battlefield. As the war progressed, these differences would become starkly visible in critical operations, where a single supply failure could determine victory or defeat. The stage was now set to examine the story from multiple perspectives: the human endurance, technological innovation, tactical implications, and psychological pressures that horses and trucks imposed on the soldiers who depended on them. The human cost of logistics in World War II is often overlooked, yet it was profoundly real. German soldiers marching alongside column after column of horse-drawn wagons were engaged in a struggle not only with the enemy, but with exhaustion, mud, and the vulnerability of their animals. Diaries from the Eastern Front describe men trudging through waist-deep mud, hands raw from handling reins, feet soaked and frozen. Horses, stretched to the breaking point, collapsed under the weight of artillery, leaving entire units stranded. Soldiers improvised, hauling cannons by hand, sharing their own rations with animals, or cutting firewood to keep horse-drawn wagons moving across frozen plains. In winter, horses shivered in sub-zero temperatures, consuming the limited fodder available. German cavalry and horse handlers became both caretakers and combatants, balancing the duties of tending to animals with facing enemy fire. One officer wrote in a 1941 report, "Our men are spent, yet our animals more so. A column halted for a single fallen horse may cost us an entire day." The mental strain was immense. Every misstep of a horse, every wagon stuck in mud, represented potential catastrophe, not just tactically, but for human survival. American troops faced a different reality. Truck drivers endured long hours on rough terrain, but the physical burden of hauling artillery or supplies on foot was largely eliminated. Mechanical failure, while a concern, was solvable with spare parts, maintenance crews, or the sheer mobility of redundant convoys. Soldiers could focus on combat and coordination, rather than walking beside exhausted animals in endless mud. The contrast created a fundamental psychological advantage. Where Germans lived with constant uncertainty and fatigue, Americans operated with predictable, reliable logistics. Technology, or the lack thereof, defined the operational difference between the two armies. German horses were remarkable for their endurance, but their performance metrics were constrained by biology. They needed food, water, rest, and shelter. Cold, heat, disease, or injury could render a horse useless. Wagons were subject to the same limitations. Wooden wheels cracked, harnesses broke, and roads, already treacherous, could stop movement entirely. The Wehrmacht attempted to supplement horsepower with motor vehicles, but production shortages and fuel scarcity made full mechanization impossible. American trucks, by contrast, brought modern engineering to the battlefield. A single 2.5-ton truck could carry more than 20 soldiers' rations or a ton of ammunition in a single trip. Engines required fuel and maintenance, but they did not tire, collapse, or panic under artillery fire. Spare parts, mechanics, and standardized design meant trucks could be repaired quickly, often returning to service within hours. Their reliability allowed U.S. forces to maintain tempo. Supply could reach forward positions as rapidly as infantry advanced, providing a decisive edge in mobility and operational reach. Even minor technological innovations magnified this advantage. Pneumatic tires allowed trucks to traverse soft ground that horses struggled with. Multi-fuel engines reduced dependence on a single supply line. Standardized cargo trailers simplified loading and unloading, increasing efficiency dramatically. In contrast, every German wagon required animal energy and careful handling, making logistics as much an art as a science. The impact of logistics on tactics is undeniable. On the battlefield, speed and flexibility can determine victory or defeat. German Blitzkrieg relied on rapid movement. Panzer divisions spearheading through enemy lines while infantry and artillery followed. Horses, however, slowed this movement. On difficult terrain or muddy roads, supply columns lagged behind tanks, forcing pauses that gave defenders time to regroup. Delays in ammunition resupply could halt an advance entirely, turning potential breakthroughs into attrition battles. American mechanized logistics changed the tactical calculus. Truck convoys allowed forces to advance quickly, sustaining momentum even over long distances. Artillery could be repositioned with relative ease. Infantry units could be resupplied mid-engagement, and reserves could be moved to exploit enemy weaknesses. The ability to deliver fuel, food, and ammunition consistently meant operational flexibility, allowing commanders to coordinate multi-pronged attacks without risking supply failure. Even in defensive operations, trucks proved decisive. When retreat became necessary, mechanized convoys could evacuate personnel, equipment, and material efficiently. German horse-drawn units, on the other hand, were vulnerable to encirclement and attrition. Stranded wagons could be captured, artillery abandoned, and horses lost, weakening entire divisions in the process. Logistic failure directly translated into battlefield disadvantage, showing that supply was not merely supportive, but a primary force multiplier. The choice between horse and truck was not merely technological. It was a matter of command philosophy and strategic foresight. German leaders, from Hitler down to divisional commanders, faced the limitations of a partially mechanized army. High command understood that motor vehicles offered speed and reliability, yet production constraints forced reliance on horses. Orders often reflected this tension. Generals had to plan operations around the endurance of animals rather than the needs of modern tactics. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt noted in 1941 that our advances are only as fast as the wagons and their beasts can endure. Logistics dictated strategy. Entire campaigns slowed, not because of enemy resistance, but because a horse-drawn artillery column could not traverse mud-filled roads. Decisions about where to allocate fuel versus fodder became daily dilemmas for officers, highlighting the intersection of resource scarcity and operational ambition. In contrast, American commanders had the confidence to plan around mechanized mobility. Logistics were predictable, allowing leaders to coordinate multi-division maneuvers across hundreds of miles. Generals could concentrate forces at decisive points, knowing supplies would arrive as scheduled. This gave U.S. forces a decisive operational edge, enabling sustained offensives that German leadership could rarely match without compromising speed or risking attrition. Leadership, therefore, was not only about tactics, it was about anticipating the limits imposed by technology and logistics. Allied and Soviet observers quickly recognized the vulnerabilities inherent in Germany's dependence on horses. Reports from Soviet frontline units in 1941 to 42 described the sight of long German supply columns stranded in mud or slowed by exhausted animals. Infantry and armor divisions often found opportunities to strike at supply lines, disrupting the enemy without engaging in frontal combat. Strike the wagons and the guns follow, one Soviet officer reportedly noted. The Allies also appreciated the advantages of mechanization. American and British troops could traverse distances quickly, reposition artillery, and maintain morale through reliable supply. From the outside, the contrast was stark. One army encumbered by living, unpredictable engines, another propelled by industrial efficiency, able to sustain prolonged operations with minimal delay. Enemy commanders understood that German speed in the early war could not be sustained indefinitely, and that logistical vulnerability would increasingly dictate the tempo of campaigns. Even German observers acknowledged the risk. Wehrmacht officers on the Eastern Front documented the challenge of moving horses across vast distances, noting that every halt or breakdown exposed units to counterattack. The enemy perspective confirmed what history would later show. Logistics were not a background factor. They were a decisive weapon, shaping both strategy and opportunity. Logistics also exerted a profound psychological influence. For German soldiers, reliance on horses was a constant source of stress and anxiety. Every step in mud or snow carried the risk of immobilizing an entire unit. Witnessing animals collapse from exhaustion under artillery fire created emotional strain. Soldiers formed bonds with their horses, yet those bonds were bittersweet, as survival often required pushing animals to their limits. Morale could collapse alongside a wagon stuck in a ditch, leaving men demoralized and fatigued. American troops experienced a different psychological reality. The hum of engines, the predictable arrival of supplies, and the absence of dependence on living animals reduced uncertainty and fear. Soldiers could focus on combat and coordination rather than improvising to rescue wagons or feed animals. This reliability fostered confidence, which in turn reinforced operational effectiveness. The moral implications extended to strategic ethics as well. Horses, sentient participants in the war effort, suffered massively due to human decisions and resource constraints. Millions would perish in the service of mobility, highlighting the human-animal cost of Germany's logistical model. Trucks, in contrast, abstracted the danger and fatigue into machines, reducing human and animal suffering while increasing operational capability. By the summer of 1941, Operation Barbarossa was underway, and the limits of Germany's reliance on horses became brutally apparent. The Wehrmacht, advancing deep into Soviet territory, faced vast distances, poor roads, and an enemy determined to defend every kilometer. Artillery columns stretched for miles, dragged by exhausted horses. Supply wagons creaked and groaned under tonnage far beyond what any animal could bear. One report from a German divisional staff noted that we are moving like a river of mud, each wagon a potential blockade, each horse a fragile engine of war. On the ground, the consequences were immediate. Tanks surged ahead, leaving infantry and artillery struggling to keep pace. Ammunition could not reach the front lines fast enough. Commanders ordered horses to pull beyond exhaustion. Some collapsed mid-pull, leaving cannons stranded in mud. Soldiers scrambled to free stuck wagons, often under enemy fire. In one documented incident near Smolensk in August 1941, an entire artillery battalion became immobilized because a bridge failed under the combined weight of wagons and guns. The German advance stalled for 3 days, allowing Soviet forces to regroup, counterattack, and inflict casualties that might have been avoided if supplies had arrived on time. Meanwhile, American mechanized units demonstrated a starkly different reality. In North Africa, U.S. and British forces maneuvered truck-borne supplies across deserts that would have immobilized horse columns. Convoys delivered fuel, water, and ammunition with precision, keeping forward units in constant motion. A single 2.5-ton truck could carry as much as 10 wagons worth of supplies, and multiple trucks in tandem could bypass obstacles with minimal delay. In Tunisia, U.S. commanders noted that mobility allowed their forces to outflank entrenched German positions repeatedly, sustaining pressure without pausing for rest or fodder. The Eastern Front provided another vivid example. During the siege of Leningrad, German supply lines were overextended. Horses, already weakened from long marches and insufficient feed, collapsed under winter snow and ice. Entire divisions reported shortages of food, ammunition, and medical supplies. Soldiers scavenged for fodder, burned wooden buildings to feed animals, and often walked alongside dying horses, pushing wagons by hand. The logistical chain, so vital to Blitzkrieg, was fracturing under the demands of modern war and harsh geography. In contrast, American trucks required maintenance and fuel, but rarely halted operations. Convoys moved on roads, across plains, and through deserts with predictable timing. Artillery could be repositioned at will. Infantry could be resupplied mid-battle, and reserves could arrive at critical points in hours rather than days. The operational flexibility granted by mechanization allowed commanders to exploit enemy weakness repeatedly, while German forces faced delays that snowballed into tactical disaster. The psychological intensity of these moments cannot be overstated. German officers reported exhaustion and despair as columns slowed to a crawl. Soldiers feared that a single breakdown, a stuck wagon, a collapsed horse, could undo days of advance. The battlefield became a test of endurance, improvisation, and sheer human will. By contrast, American troops experienced the opposite sensation. Confidence in logistics translated directly into confidence in combat, reinforcing morale and reducing fear. At every critical juncture, supply determined opportunity. During the early stages of the Eastern Front campaign, German panzer divisions could advance hundreds of miles in days, but when artillery lagged behind, breakthroughs stalled. When horses collapsed in mud or snow, the army's mobility and its ability to exploit victory vanished. Mechanized trucks, by contrast, ensured that American and Allied forces could sustain operations, launch repeated offensives, and maintain an operational tempo that the horse-drawn Wehrmacht could not match. The stage was now set for the turning point of the logistical struggle, a confrontation in which the limits of horsepower, exhaustion, and fragile supply chains would collide with the precision and endurance of mechanized mobility, determining the fate of campaigns, divisions, and men on the winter of 1941–42 would become a crucible for Germany's reliance on horses. Deep in the Soviet Union, the Wehrmacht advanced relentlessly, but supply lines began to fray. Horse-drawn wagons struggled through knee-deep snow, mud, and ice. Reports from the 6th Army noted that entire artillery batteries were immobilized when horses collapsed under freezing temperatures. Soldiers improvised, pulling guns by hand, yet progress slowed to a crawl. Units went days without ammunition or food, trapped by the limits of their living engines. At the Battle of Moscow in December 1941, logistical failure became operational reality. Temperatures plummeted to -30 degrees Celsius. Horses, unaccustomed to such extremes and starved of adequate fodder, began dying en masse. Wagons, mired in snow, blocked roads for other units. German infantry faced enemy fire without adequate artillery support. Memoirs describe soldiers trudging alongside fallen animals, shivering in the same frost that felled their mounts. One officer recorded, "The horses, once our strength, have become our Achilles' heel. Every mile forward costs lives, both human and animal." In contrast, American mechanized forces in North Africa and later in Italy showcased the decisive advantage of trucks. Convoys delivered supplies across deserts and mountains with remarkable consistency. Even in extreme heat, engines hummed, wheels turned, and soldiers received rations and ammunition on time. Commanders could coordinate offensives with confidence, knowing that mobility would not be interrupted by the exhaustion of animals or the collapse of a wagon. Trucks allowed units to advance rapidly, resupply, and redeploy, while German columns stalled or became trapped. The consequences of these contrasting logistical realities were stark. During Operation Barbarossa, the inability to maintain pace forced German units to halt near Smolensk and Vyazma, providing Soviet forces with critical time to reinforce and counterattack. Supply failures directly influenced tactical outcomes. Artillery that could not move left infantry vulnerable, ammunition shortages stalled assaults, and soldiers endured extreme fatigue. In some instances, forward units ran out of food entirely, forcing retreats that might have been avoided with mechanized logistics. Time-stamped accounts reveal the severity. On December 5, 1941, a report from the 4th Panzer Army noted that over 1,200 horses had died in a single week, immobilizing 36 artillery pieces. Supply wagons sank in mud and snowdrifts. Soldiers improvised makeshift sleds to transport food, water, and weapons. Yet despite these heroic efforts, the Army's momentum faltered, and the Red Army seized the initiative. Mechanization, even in smaller numbers, had proved superior to sheer quantity of living transport. Meanwhile, American mechanized units executed complex operations with minimal interruption. Truck convoys enabled sustained attacks, artillery repositioning, and rapid resupply of frontline troops. U.S. commanders documented that a single convoy could deliver more than 10 horse-drawn wagons worth of supplies in a single trip, while requiring far fewer personnel. These operations demonstrated a fundamental shift in modern warfare. Mechanical reliability could achieve what living power could not, and operational speed depended less on endurance and more on engineering, planning, and foresight. By the spring of 1942, the picture was clear. Germany's reliance on horses had become a strategic vulnerability. Units remained immobilized, offensives stalled, and soldiers bore the physical and emotional toll of sustaining campaigns with insufficient mechanized support. American and Allied forces, though fewer in absolute numbers of vehicles, leveraged mechanization to maintain tempo, surprise, and operational flexibility. The battlefield had become a stage where supply lines dictated outcomes, and mechanical efficiency decisively outweighed tradition, endurance, or brute force. The decisive lesson of these campaigns was unmistakable. In modern warfare, speed and reliability are as lethal as guns and tanks. Horses, once symbols of power and mobility, could not withstand the demands of industrialized combat. Trucks, engines, and organized supply networks dictated not only tactical possibilities, but strategic fate. Each sides of the battlefield. By 1942, the consequences of Germany's reliance on horses were starkly visible across multiple fronts. Millions of animals had perished from exhaustion, starvation, and exposure. Estimates suggest that by the end of 1942, over 1.5 million German horses had died in service. Each loss was more than a statistic. It represented artillery immobilized, rations undelivered, and the slowing of entire divisions. Diaries from the Eastern Front describe soldiers trudging alongside collapsing animals, improvising supply methods, and enduring long marches with empty stomachs and freezing hands. Commanders were forced to ration food, delay offensives, or abandon weapons and equipment because the living engines of war had failed. Artillery units suffered disproportionately. Guns meant to provide covering fire for infantry were often left behind, stuck in mud, or abandoned when horses could no longer pull them. Infantry attacks slowed, defensive positions weakened, and enemy forces seized opportunities created not by tactical genius, but by logistical failure. German field reports repeatedly highlight that our advance is limited not by the enemy, but by our supply chains. A stalled column of wagons could immobilize an entire division for days, leaving units vulnerable to counterattack. The human toll was equally severe. Soldiers faced fatigue and demoralization alongside their horses. Witness accounts reveal the emotional strain of watching animals collapse or die, knowing that each loss hindered the army's operational capacity. Morale suffered as men became painfully aware that victory depended not just on courage or firepower, but on the frailty of the animals supporting them. Veterinary staff worked tirelessly, yet could do little against the scale of attrition and harsh environmental conditions. Meanwhile, American mechanized forces demonstrated the value of industrial efficiency. Their relatively small number of trucks, just 6,000 in the early campaigns, could deliver the logistical equivalent of hundreds of horse-drawn wagons. Trucks enabled rapid redeployment of artillery, resupply of frontline troops, and sustained offensives over vast distances. Units could maintain tempo and operational flexibility without the constant human and animal fatigue that plagued German forces. U.S. commanders consistently highlighted the morale benefits. Soldiers trusted that supplies would arrive, artillery would be repositioned, and operations could continue uninterrupted. The disparity in mobility directly influenced outcomes. In North Africa, mechanized supply allowed U.S. and British forces to outmaneuver Axis positions repeatedly. In the Soviet Union, German horse-drawn columns became predictable, slow-moving targets for counterattacks. Each logistical advantage gained by the Allies translated directly into battlefield initiative, speed, and ultimately survival. Supply lines were no longer mere support. They had become decisive instruments of war. Strategically, the aftermath revealed that Germany's early successes masked an underlying vulnerability. Blitzkrieg worked only when speed and coordination outpaced the enemy. When horses could not maintain the necessary pace, entire operations faltered. The attritional cost of sustaining millions of animals, feeding them, and managing their health placed immense pressure on Germany's war economy. Meanwhile, American production of vehicles, spare parts, and fuel continued largely uninterrupted, turning logistical efficiency into a force multiplier that would dominate the later stages of the conflict. By the end of 1942, the German High Command was forced to acknowledge the limits of their reliance on horses. Mechanization was prioritized where possible, but industrial and resource constraints meant that full motorization remained a distant goal. The battlefield had made clear the consequences. Mobility, not just firepower, decided survival. The stage was now set to explore the full strategic and human aftermath of this clash of logistics. The cumulative impact of logistics on World War II extended beyond individual battles. It reshaped entire campaigns and influenced strategic decisions. By 1943, Germany's reliance on 2.8 million horses had become a critical weakness. Across the Eastern Front, millions of animals had died, leaving artillery immobile, supply lines vulnerable, and soldiers increasingly fatigued. Units that once advanced swiftly under Blitzkrieg doctrine were now slowed to a crawl. Reports from the German High Command admitted openly that operational tempo was severely constrained by the endurance of our animals. Food and fodder shortages further compounded the problem. Grain and hay diverted to horses strained civilian populations, while soldiers often went hungry to sustain the animals. Winter and spring mud rendered roads impassable, immobilizing entire columns and leaving frontline units exposed. In some cases, entire artillery batteries had to be abandoned when horses collapsed under load. The loss of living transport created a domino effect. Infantry became vulnerable, defensive positions weakened, and counteroffensives exploited gaps in movement. By contrast, American forces, though employing only 6,000 trucks in the early campaigns, maintained operational superiority through mechanization. Trucks enabled resupply across long distances, rapid troop movements, and the repositioning of artillery and tanks. The psychological advantage was equally important. Soldiers knew that supplies would arrive reliably. The Army could sustain offensive and defensive operations without the uncertainty that plagued horse-dependent forces. Even in harsh terrain, from the deserts of North Africa to the mountains of Italy, mechanized logistics allowed the U.S. and allies to outmaneuver and outlast their opponents. Strategically, the contrast shaped late war campaigns. Germany's inability to fully mechanize limited operational flexibility slowed reinforcements and contributed to failed offensives such as Case Blue in 1942 and the Battle of Kursk in 1943. In some instances, horse-drawn units were easily outflanked by mechanized Allied columns. Conversely, American logistics allowed rapid redeployment and concentration of force, giving commanders the ability to exploit weak points, sustain multi-front offensives, and maintain pressure on retreating Axis forces. The human and material consequences were staggering. Millions of horses had perished in service. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers suffered exhaustion, frostbite, and malnutrition as they struggled to keep the supply chain moving. Allied forces, though exposed to combat, faced fewer logistical vulnerabilities, reducing both physical and psychological strain on troops. Post-war analyses by historians consistently highlight this disparity as a decisive factor in operational success. Industrialized mobility, not numerical superiority of living transport, determined which armies could sustain prolonged campaigns. In a broader context, these logistical lessons influenced military doctrine for decades. The war demonstrated that mobility and supply efficiency were decisive weapons. Mechanized logistics allowed armies to project power far beyond the reach of traditional transport, creating a shift in the very nature of operational planning. Germany's experience revealed the vulnerabilities of dependence on living transport, while the U.S. showcased the transformative effect of industrialized warfare. As the smoke of battle cleared and historians cataloged the scale of loss and innovation, it became clear that logistics had shaped not only outcomes, but the very character of modern war. This sets the stage for reflection. What these lessons mean for history, technology, and humanity itself. The story of horses and trucks in World War II is not just about transportation. It is a story of adaptation, endurance, and the relentless march of technology. Two armies faced the same war, yet their fates were shaped not only by guns and tanks, but by the means by which they carried food, ammunition, and artillery across fields, mud, and snow. Germany's 2.8 million horses were silent participants in history, their strength and suffering an invisible backbone of campaigns. Each hoofbeat carried men, guns, and hope forward, yet also carried vulnerability, the fragility of life against the unforgiving demands of modern war. Across the ocean, America's 6,000 trucks embodied the power of industrial foresight. Mechanical engines replaced living ones, allowing mobility, speed, and reliability that horses could never provide. Soldiers could rely on supply lines that moved with predictable precision, enabling offensives that extended across deserts, forests, and plains. The psychological impact was profound. Confidence in logistics reinforced confidence in combat, turning industrial might into a decisive weapon alongside rifles and artillery. This contrast underscores a broader truth. Warfare is not won by courage alone, nor by numbers of men or beasts. It is won by the ability to sustain, supply, and adapt, by logistics that keep the body and mind of an army moving forward. Horses gave Germany early mobility, but in a world of engines and assembly lines, their limitations became fatal. Trucks gave America efficiency, endurance, and the freedom to operate at a pace that living transport could not match. In the end, this story is also a human story. It reminds us of the cost of war, not only in lives lost, but in the silent sacrifices of animals and the tireless endurance of soldiers. It reminds us that innovation, planning, and adaptation can change the course of conflict. And it reminds us that history often hinges on the smallest, most practical details: the speed of a convoy, the health of a horse, the reliability of a truck. In the fields, the mud, the frozen roads of Europe, and the sunlit highways of America, the wheels turned, the hooves fell, and the future of modern warfare was decided, not only by strategy, but by the quiet, unheralded power of logistics.